really lovely to see so many familiar faces. I'm getting so used to the people who come to my lectures and the people that come to my Coaches Engaged meetings and stuff. It's really nice. I feel like I've got a little mini family, so thank you for being here. We've got an hour together as normal. We'll be finishing at 7:30, and my anticipation is that the talk will take somewhere between half an hour and 45 minutes, and then we'll do a bit of reflection and Q&A and whatever comes up at the end of that, but we'll be finished by 7:30 nonetheless. For those who don't know me, I'm Nick Bolton. I'm the founder of Animas Founder for Coaching and the International Centre for Coaching Supervision. Can I just get a bit of a show of hands? If you can use your virtual hands, might be the easiest thing. If put your virtual hand up if you've been, or wave your physical hand if you're on camera, if you've been to one of these lectures in the last few weeks. In other words, you've been to the first few that I've done. Okay, great, thank you. And if you can, when your little yellow hand goes down, if you can put your hand up if you haven't been. So I'm assuming that's the rest of you, but sometimes that's not the case. Okay, great. Well, it's useful to know that because these lectures are building on each other. So they're in a sense, they are kind of iterative and they are self-referencing. As a result, there's going to be things I talk about that came from previous lectures that I won't go into detail again this time, but all of the content, all of the videos are on YouTube. So if you go to youtube.com/animascoaching, you will find the other lectures there. And I think it is worthwhile to actually go and check those out because it definitely does fit together like a bit of a jigsaw puzzle. And even as I was putting this presentation together, I was noticing the extent of repetition, not in a bad sense, but in a way that all becomes quite an integrated approach to think about transformative theory and transformative coaching. And so it's worthwhile revisiting some of that stuff to think about what do we mean by the integrative approach and the unifying theory, and what do we mean by systemic and holistic, and the idea of the emancipatory approach of transformative work, and all that kind of stuff. It's worth taking a look at. Just Nick, for those of you who haven't been to these lectures, I'll repeat what I've said every time, which is that I'm on a bit of a journey myself to really think through what does transformative coaching mean. I've been a transformative coach for many years, but in many ways, it was something that came intuitively to my natural style of how I think about life and how I think about change, and didn't really take the time to go deep into the theory that sat behind it. And so there's a lot of kind of discovery going on for me, and it's really fascinating to just go, oh, that's interesting how this bit fits with this bit, and maybe I hadn't thought of it in those terms before. So a lot of what I talk about when I do these talks and these lectures is really very fresh, and as a result I want you to kind of treat it with a very strong degree of, what's the word, not caution, not suspicion or caution, but just a massive pinch of salt. You know, this isn't some well-established theory that's been tested and proven over 20 years. Certainly what I'm calling upon here is that sort of theory, but I'm putting it together in my own way. So what I'm sharing with you this evening, or whatever time of day it is for you, is very much fresh thinking about relatively well-established ideas. And as a result, by the way, for one of the sort of the kind of the questions I'm picking up quite a lot is, to what extent does what I'm talking about fit with the Animas course? And this really isn't about the Animas course. This is my thinking as the founder of a coaching school and as somebody who's just always contemplating what we do as coaches. But there might be people on this call who aren't training with us. So this isn't about some kind of fit with our course. It's a much broader kind of exploration of coaching. Great. So on that note, let's dive in. Today, I'm going to share my screen. Today, we're talking about the transformative. Sorry, we're talking about the. That's obvious. It's the transformative coaching series. We're talking about the psychological dimension to transformative coaching. So let me just. My goodness, with Zoom, you've got all these different boxes you've got to move just to find the present button. There we go. Great. Hopefully, everyone's seeing that. So I've called this an inside job ? The psychological dimension to transformative coaching. And I want to start by thinking about where are we on my integrative model of transformative coaching and the 5 principles. And so this was the loose model that we've created, which is phenomenological in the center, in other words, the client's experience, holistic and systemic, psychological, humanistic, and then integrative wrapping all around it. And we've looked at the humanistic, we've looked at holistic and systemic. Last time we looked at integrative. So now we're investigating the psychological. So what we're going to cover this evening are, first of all, what do we mean by the psychological perspective on transformation? Like, what is psychological is a big word. It can mean many things. So let's try to at least define the term we're using here. And then we'll take a look at what I'm calling the chronology of change. You could think of it as a sequence of change, or maybe if you're a bit more literary, you could think of it as the syntax of change, but it doesn't really matter too much. But I'm kind of fascinated by what is the process for change to unfold in different kinds of coaching, whether that's performance coaching, developmental coaching, or transformative coaching, and what do we expect to happen at different stages along that coaching journey that would make it one or the other? And I suppose this is a good time, by the way, to say that it's really important to not think of this as good or bad, better or worse, like, oh, transformative coaching, this is the bee's knees, and performance coaching, no. They're all appropriate for the kind of work you're doing. Sometimes a performance coaching is exactly the kind of coaching that's needed. Sometimes developmental coaching is needed. Sometimes transformative coaching is needed. So it's really important to recognize that what we're not doing here is saying, hey, we've come up with some amazing process for human change that makes everything else look old-fashioned. It's not about that. It's about saying, what is the change that needs to take place here for the client to move to where they want to get to? Then we'll take a look at these psychological foundations, and this is where there might be a bit of repetition. We'll go back to the very first lecture in which I answered the question, what is transformative coaching? And so we'll revisit some of the work around Jack Mezirow, George Kelly, and Colt Rivera on his psychology of worldviews, and we'll just touch again about, what are those really core foundations to transformative theory. But then we'll take a look at psychologically informed approaches, and that's somewhat different. That's more about what fits into transformative work that nonetheless comes from a psychological background. And then I'm going to share with you a model for transformative inquiry, which I put together for this talk, as in I sort of reverse engineered how I think about coaching. And when I do coaching at a transformative level, what is it I'm doing? What am I trying to create at some level? And so hopefully this will give you a very practical, not a model, but a practical map of how you take this psychological approach to coaching and transformative coaching in particular, and really start to think, what does it look like during a coaching session? And then finally, I just want to talk about ethics. I think there's an important conversation to be had around the ethics of transformative work, and what does it mean for you as practitioners to be working both psychologically and transformatively, and what does that call upon in terms of what you need to be cognizant of, competent in, and really ethically founded upon. So we'll take a look at as the last point. So with that whole kind of groundwork in place, let's take a look at psychological perspective on transformation and what do we mean by psychological? Well, quite simply, and I'll read it out because I know it's nothing worse than somebody saying one thing and the writing saying another. So within our framework, the psychological stance relates to the fact that transformative coaching seeks to evoke awareness, critical reflection, and the potential for change of a client's inner world, their mental map of meaning. So in other words, transformative work is psychological by its very nature. So in a sense, to be transformative is to be psychological. And since we create mental shifts as opposed to only changes in external situation or outcome. So at its very heart, it's almost, I would almost say it's a synonym, except for it's possible to be psychological without being transformative. So it's not really a synonym. So if you like, transformative is a kind of psychological, but psychological is not a kind of transformative. And I think as we go through the rest of the session, that'll become clearer. I'm going to read it out again just because I can see when I'm looking at the screen, I'm like, oh, looks a bit like full of words. So let me read it again. Within our framework, the psychological stance relates to the fact that transformative coaching seeks to evoke awareness, critical reflection, and the potential for change of a client's inner world, their mental map of meaning. In a sense, to be transformative is to be psychological, as we create mental shifts as opposed to only changes in situation or outcome. Though to be psychological is not necessarily to be transformative. So that's what we mean by that word. But let's take a quick reminder of the definition of transformative. So when we think about psychological, in what sense is it transformative? What do we mean by that word? Well, quite simply, transformative coaching for us explores a client's inner world of beliefs, assumptions, values, and expectations in order to create greater possibilities for ways of being in life. So there's a very deliberate attempt within transformative coaching to focus on what goes on inside the human being, such that what goes on outside changes. It's entirely possible and entirely appropriate sometimes to only focus on the outside change. In other words, what are the behavioural changes that need to take place that will evoke some kind of external situational change? That's sometimes all you need to do. But there are other times that you need to go deeper. There's a really great book that I'm reading at the moment. I can't think who the author is. It's a Polish coach, and I think it's just called Psychological Coaching. Anyway, it's quite new. And I really like one of the things he says. His point is that you should do the kind of coaching that is least, I'm trying to think how he says it, essentially least intensive for the result that's needed. In other words, don't do transformative coaching if all you need to do is behavioral coaching. Don't do developmental coaching if you need to do behavioral coaching. Don't do transformative if all it's needed is developmental. You need to do the least needed to get the result the client is contracting for. Now, as you go along, and I'll talk about this later, there might be moments where you think, oh, this doesn't feel like that the outcome they really want is actually the outcome they really want. And that's the time to begin to explore, well, hold on, is this a transformative journey we need to be on? But at the outset, the contract is the contract. And so if what they want is a pay rise, that's what you're coaching on, until it becomes clear that the pay rise is a cover for something else. And if it's all it's about is pay rise, maybe it's a behavioral coaching. And so transformative coaching is a very deliberate exploration of the inner world, which is why, by the way, the integrative stance that we talked about in the last session and the concept of a unifying theory is so critical to transformative coaching. Because if you don't have that central unifying theory that you're working on a basis of transformative change, any model can be used without a sense of, well, what are we trying to do here? What's the outcome? Well, the outcome is perspective shift. For those of you who are on the second lecture, I think, I talked about Robert Keegan, and he asked a really simple but beautiful question, which is, what is the form that transforms? He was writing about transformative learning, but it's the same for coaching. What is the form that transforms? And his answer was the frame of reference. In other words, the perspective we take, the paradigm, the worldview, the model of the world, whatever linguistic shortcut you want to use. What's changing is the inner mental map and the meaning-making process that somebody uses. And that's the change that's taking place. So therefore, that becomes the unifying theory that transformative coaching is about. So let's talk about the chronology of change. And this, again, is something that I was walking recently, doing the North Downs Way. Thought I'd do some wild camping. And as I was walking along, I started thinking about the chronology of change and the idea of sequences within coaching and what do they look like for each kind of coaching. And so I've come up with this broadly what I think is an effective model for thinking about how change unfolds in different kinds of coaching. Before we look at it, though, let's take a look at, remind ourselves of the Mezirow's 10 stages of transformative learning and my mapping over that, the 3 levels of coaching, because that will help us see how those chronologies of change make sense within this. So let me remind you what that looks like. So Mezirow, Jack Mezirow, who was the founder, is that the right word? But the person that sort of came up with the concept of transformative learning, came up with this idea of 10 stages of transformative change. And they were, that first, we encounter a disorienting dilemma. Something happens that makes us go, phew, wasn't expecting that. Or I wanted this, but I didn't get it. Or I thought I was this kind of person, but I'm not that kind of person. Whatever it is. Something makes you go like, that's a disorienting dilemma. You go through a process of self-examination. What is it about me? And so on. And you start to really think about yourself. And then you make a critical assessment of your assumptions about the world. And then you have a recognition that you're not alone, that you connect to a wider ecology of people who are also sharing similar moments of transformation, similar self-reflections, critical reflection, and so on. And then you have an exploration of new roles and possibilities. You develop a plan of action. You gain new knowledge and skills to implement that plan. You try out the plan. You develop new competence and self-confidence in your new roles. And you reintegrate into your life on the basis of new perspectives. That was Jack Mezirow's 10 stages of transformative learning. And what I realized was that fundamentally you can map the 3 approaches to coaching over the top of this, such that those first 5 stages become the transformative stages. The client is coming to you as a transformative coach, and they've encountered a disorienting dilemma. You go through a process with them of self-examination, of thinking about their beliefs, their values, their ways of thinking about themselves, their self-concept, their concept of the world, and so on. And then you critically assess those assumptions. You bring them into the open, and then you start to question them. I'll talk later about Socratic questioning, because I think Socrates was often, it's not so much Socrates was misunderstood, but Socrates has been oversimplified within the coaching world. Socrates had a particular way. If any of you read Plato, he had a particular way of doing dialogue. Socrates wasn't just asking questions, he was interrogating belief structures. And so this is the same sort of thing. We're really interrogating belief structures. And then we enable the client to recognize that they're part of wider systems, systemic and holistic, and we explore new roles. So that's the transformative part. And then it's moving into the performance part, which is great. Now let's do something. Let's turn this into action. We help the client devise goals and actions and plans and strategies and whatever else it might be they need to take into the world. And at some point, they begin to get feedback from the world. Is this working? Isn't it working? What's not working? What could work better? And then finally, they begin to develop a new level of competence and self-confidence within their new role. And by role, I mean, who are they being in the world? That could be as a partner, as an employee, as a boss, as a human being, doesn't matter. And then they're reintegrating it. And that would be the developmental stage of coaching. So those are just to kind of remind you of Mezirow's 10 stages and the mapping. Now let's look at how does change unfold within each of these phases. So I'm going to start off, let me start with a caveat. An important caveat. The following, this is like a legal statement. The following does not represent a simple linear process, nor the truth of how change unfolds. So I'm putting that out there. This is a model of reality rather than reality itself. So it represents the principle of transformation rather than me saying, this is how it unfolds, take it or leave it. So with that caveat done, this is how I make sense of performance coaching. First of all, a client identifies a desired change in their life, whatever that might be, and they come to you, step one, and they have a goal. And I've used that word advisedly. In the others, I'm going to use the word outcome. But in performance coaching, we tend to talk about goals. It's pretty clear, it's measurable, it's specific, it's time-bound, all those kinds of things that made my first coaching school called the SMART School of Coaching, because I used to do performance coach training, and it was a SMART goal. So they come to us with a pretty clear, or they want to get a pretty clear goal in mind for the change they want. It could be a career change, it could be a relationship change, it could be a fitness change, it could be anything. From there, through a process of coaching, they begin to take actions. Fundamentally, performance coaching is, alrighty, that's what you want, what are you going to do? And within that, there might be certain questions about what have you done so far, and what have you tried, and what have you learned, and da-da-da-da. But fundamentally, the next step is, what are you going to do? What are your actions going to be? And then from those actions, everything being well, they get the outcome they want. The goal is achieved. And that's really fundamentally the coaching complete at a performance level. There may be a psychological shift, but the psychological shift is a byproduct, not an intrinsic part of performance coaching. It might be, by achieving the outcome, something naturally shifts for them mentally. They see the world differently, they see themselves differently, they see other people differently because of the outcome that's happened for them. Let's imagine, for instance, that the outcome was, I want to become a senior manager, whatever that thing is. They become a senior manager, and in doing so, they have to reorient themselves to how they manage people. And that in itself creates a psychological shift that they weren't expecting, but they didn't come in needing that. In a sense, it's an accidental byproduct. So that's the kind of the chronology of performance coaching. Next up, we have developmental coaching. Very similar broad pattern. Client identifies desired change. Typically, though, with developmental coaching, it's more outcome related. It's not going to be a one and done sort of outcome. It's a goal. It's going to be something more about, I want to relate to my staff better. I want to have a better attitude to health. It tends to be more around a broader picture of an outcome rather than I want to lose this much weight, or I want to gain this much muscle, or I want to, get this next career move, or whatever it might be. It tends to be much broader about how they're showing up in the world. So then what happens is we go through a coaching process that's more around learning and growth. What are you learning about yourself? What are you learning about the situation? What could you do within that that's going to enable learning to take place? And so the outcome of that is action and learning combined. They're acting into the world, but with a view to be learning about themselves or learning about the situation. And then the third step is that the client increases competence and capacity in whatever field they're involved in. And so we could say that the significant outcome is the outcome plus growth. And then finally, I would say that broadly within developmental coaching, the result is psychological consolidation, by which I mean that developmental coaching tends to reinforce and nuance existing strengths rather than fundamentally challenge the underlying frame of reference that somebody holds about the world or about a situation. In other words, a lot of developmental coaching is, for instance, using a strength finder. How do you get better at using what you're good at and not needing to use what you're not so good at? It reinforces mental maps through a developmental process of consolidation on the whole. As I said at the start, don't forget, big asterisk, this doesn't represent truth. It's a kind of model of how I see these things. And of course, like anything, there are great areas which overlap. So moving into transformative coaching, this is where there's a real shift in the syntax. So the first one, same again, the client identifies desired change, and typically there's going to be an outcome rather than a goal. And here's where it gets interesting. As a transformative coach, the next phase is one of inquiry and loosening. And so there's a transformative inquiry into the frames of reference and other possibilities. So rather than going straight into action mode based on what are your existing strengths, what are your current competencies, rather than going into a learning mode around who are you as a person that we need to draw from and consolidate around, we're looking at what needs to be loosened up in your map of the world. What is not serving you? And so we go through a transformative inquiry, which I'll talk through later with my model. This then leads to the client experimenting into the world. And this is your action phase. And I've showed you that with Mezirow's 10 steps. Now they've had their brain loosened a bit, shaken up. And now it's like, okay, let me try that in the world somehow and see what the results are. And finally, we end up with mental shift. As Mezirow talks about the idea of reintegration of the new experience into a mental framework that is not the same as it was when it started. That for me is transformative change. Now I want to be really, really clear that this is me talking. This is not the truth. There will be other coaches, other schools, other authors, other everything that say, that's not my version of transformative coaching. That's fine. So please don't assume that this is me saying this is my take on transformative coaching, and it's the one that kind of disseminates through Animas at various levels. So very briefly, let's talk about examples of change and how we can think about those. And I'm not going to spend too long on this because I just looked at my watch and it's already 5:02. But I was thinking about this, like if we think about learning to drive is an absolute classic performance approach to coaching, you would think. I suspect it is, but it can have transformative dimensions to it. So typically you would call this instrumental learning. You learn to drive in order to achieve a certain goal, which is to get in a car, drive safely and legally from A to B, and hopefully get to the other end. But as a result of that, there can be a byproduct of transformation. Let's imagine you think all human beings are fundamentally selfish. That's your map of the world as you go into this. But when you start driving, you notice how many people flash their lights to let you out. You notice how people wave you on. You notice how people thank you for every little thing you do as a driver. And you go, that's not the world I was expecting. So you have a transformative process as a byproduct of an instrumental change. Then we think of something like moving house and all the stresses that come from that. Now, typically, moving house is going to start. By the way, I realize few people come to coaches for moving house, I suspect. But you get my point. I'm looking at situational parts of life here. Moving house, fundamentally, you want to get a certain outcome. But moving house can have transformative impacts as you start to interact with new people, move into a new area, experience new ways of being in a new area, realize that you've got to get rid of all this junk that you've acquired over your life, and you realize it's time to let go of that old version of me. All this kind of stuff has transformative moments. Getting a new job, finding a new partner, improving a relationship, starting a business, becoming physically healthier, whatever it might be. All of these things have the potential to be both, or let's say, what's the opposite? What's both but not single? Thrice. All these things have the opportunity to be thrice performance, developmental, and transformative, depending on how you approach it, and more importantly, what the client's really looking to get from the coaching. All right, so there was another one. What was that? That looked interesting. Overcoming bereavement. All of these, same again, could be treated in a way that's performance, developmental, or transformative. What's really important is the contract is right. And when I say contract, I mean the psychological contract, and are you on the same page? And I'll come to that a little later. So let's talk about psychological foundations. Since we're talking about the psychological dimension to transformative coaching, what are the psychological foundations? Well, fundamentally, transformative coaching is predicated on personal construct theory. Personal construct theory was the work of a psychologist called George Kelly back in the 1950s. And the fundamental notion is that you have a constructivist ontology. You have a constructive epistemology, but the constructivist ontology is that reality exists, but we can never reach it. So unlike some forms of theory around ontology, it doesn't deny the fundamental existence of the world, but it denies our ability to ever reach it. And so what it ends up with is this idea that we're all construct our own version of the world based on our construal process that we have mentally. That's the epistemology. That's the way we know. So the ontology is, yeah, the world exists. Guess what? You can't reach it. What we can do is make models of the world that serve us in some way. Hence, the epistemology is one of constructivism. So meaning is construed, worldviews are then formed, and on the basis of those worldviews, behavior is solidified or ossified or in some way rigidified, such that without that critical reflection and the unpicking of the worldview, our behavior tends to be quite repetitive in some way. Same relationship styles, same work styles, same whatever it might be style. However, the good news is, under personal construct theory, is guess what? It can be deconstructed and reconstructed. So personal construct theory is a phenomenally empowering psychology because it doesn't care about things like unconscious drivers that we have no control over. It doesn't come from a psychodynamic perspective that says, hey, there are these drivers inside us that are out of our control, out of our awareness, and we can only get a glimpse at through certain things like dreams and slips of the tongue and all that kind of stuff. No, this is entirely possible to deconstruct your worldview and reconstruct it. And that brings us to the Socratic kind of dialogue, which I'll talk about later. And one of the things that Kelly talked about was the idea of the person as a scientist of their life. And I think it's such a beautiful metaphor that at any point we can start to experiment with what it means to be ourselves. And don't forget, science is the art of seeing what happens when something is done, measuring it, and seeing the repetition of that. Can it be, I can't think what the word is now, but can it be replicated? And can it be falsified? One of the great philosophers of science was Karl Popper, and he sort of came up with the concept of the falsification, which is now central to science. And so you could say, can I falsify this theory I'm thinking about myself? Can I falsify this idea? So in other words, you're testing both its applicability and its likely failure points. What are its kind of single points of failure? So I love this idea of person as a scientist of the life. It gives you, it's much more playful. You know, it's much more free for you to go and play with things. So that was the first kind of psychological model that really laid the foundations for transformative theory. Bear with me 1 second. Okay, so then we move into transformative theory proper, and that came from the work of Jack Mezirow. Wrote his first book in 1991 and came up with this concept of transformative learning. And his concern was that most learning was what he would call instrumental. It helped people be more effective in the current paradigm they accepted as being true. In other words, you weren't fundamentally questioning the water you were swimming in as a fish, you were just learning to swim better. So his concept was, well, how do you know the water you're swimming in is the right water for you? And that led to his concept of transformative learning, which is that all adult learning should fundamentally have a transformative process within it that enables somebody to look at themselves and say, am I being emancipated from a system that I'm not even aware I'm part of? So the first thing that he talked about was the centrality of experience. I call that the phenomenological centrality. It's the center of my 5 principles. And then critical reflection needs to take place. Critical reflection being a very deliberate process of thinking about the beliefs and frameworks you hold that you take for granted as being true, and thinking, well, what if they weren't true? And I promise you, if you want to see how critical reflection can be done well, read Plato. Just Socrates was the master of critical reflection. His ability to elicit from somebody a belief and then challenge it by asking questions that made them think, well, what if that, would it still be true? He was a master at breaking down and deconstructing beliefs, or at least Plato made him a master. Whether he really was, who knows? And then rational discourse is the next part of Mezirow's concept, which is that critical reflection happens best through rational discourse, which for us would be called coaching. In other words, it's one thing for me to sit at home with a cup of coffee, critically reflecting. It's another to have somebody challenging me through rational discourse. And then finally, that would lead to what he would call a perspective shift, and that's transformation. The third lens I would hold over this, and it's not one that's well known, but I think it's incredibly useful, but incredibly dense, and so therefore I'm not going to go into too much detail, is the work of Kolka Rivera, who wrote a paper. I don't know when it was written. I think it was early 2000s. I think it's on the campus if you're part of Animas, but it was called The Psychology of Worldviews. And he basically did a meta-analysis of all the various worldview psychologies that had existed and pulled it together in a really meaningful way, such that he kind of framed what are all the possible ways of thinking about the world and ourselves and so on, that somebody could hold in a unique configuration that mapped who they were. So essentially it came down to views around human nature, views around will, personal will and agency. In other words, personal agency or fate or destiny or whatever it might be, determinism or whatever it might be. Cognition, how does thinking take place? Behavior, interpersonal, truth, and world and life. And all of those he broke down into many more subsections. So for instance, in human nature, one of the areas is, are human beings essentially good or bad? Or are they essentially amoral? In other words, they have no moral basis, and so on. So he broke each one down into specifics. And in a way, you can almost map somebody's worldview by going through each of these bits. I wouldn't do that, by the way. This is not a diagnostic process, but theoretically, you could go, this would be an interesting exercise to go through Rivera's worldview map, if you like, and really put together almost like a construction of all their belief systems. It'd be fascinating to do. But fundamentally, if you're interested in checking out Kolka Rivera's work, just search for Kolka Rivera's Psychology of Worldviews PDF on Google, and you'll find the download. It's not behind a firewall, so you can easily get it. But it's a fascinating way of looking at, really, and you think about Mezirow talking about rational discourse. This approach is very rational. Some people might find it too rational, and I get that. Some people might be, come from a much more mystical or somatic or whatever it might be experience. But I find this an incredibly useful way of thinking about how we map the world mentally. And then recalling what I talked about last time, the unifying theory, unifying transformative theory, is that the heart of transformative theory is that transformative change takes place at the level of mental paradigm shift. And as a result, we integrate whatever supports that transformative approach. We don't just go, oh, that's interesting, I'll do that. That creates a change. Well, it might, but is it a transformative change? For instance, and I talked about this last time, I've never felt that neurolinguistic programming is what I would call a transformative approach. It's not a bad approach. It could be a phenomenally great approach, but I don't think it's transformative because it doesn't create a rational shift in the mental map of the world. It creates a symbolic shift through the use of things like submodalities and giving things more or less color or making it louder or brighter or whatever it might be. It creates a symbolic shift, but not a rational shift that we can say, now I understand the world differently. So I think it's really important when we think of transformative theory that we have some notion of what is it we're plugging into that that makes it useful to coach that way rather than a different way. I hope that makes sense. And this is why I'm going to cover some of the approaches we think of as being transformative from a psychological perspective. I talked last time as well about transformative coaching being an emancipatory practice and not a coping mechanism. And I think that's a useful thing to share, because I do find certain practices within coaching are more about coping. And that's okay. Again, this is not a good or bad thing. It's just recognizing what's their function. And so certain practices are about, I'm not going to change my system. I'm not going to change my understanding of my system. I'm going to change how I feel about my being in the system. That would be a coping mechanism or a way of being mechanism. And so, for instance, I've said this last time, I'm sure people will shoot me down for this, but I think mindfulness is often a coping mechanism versus an emancipatory mechanism. I likewise think sometimes positive psychology can become more of a coping mechanism than an emancipatory mechanism. I totally get I could be wrong. And I could have a conversation with Janet Jacob, who's a great positive psychologist, and he would shoot me down in no time, and I'm okay with that. I'm just sharing kind of my perspective. I think some things help us exist within a system, and that might be exactly what we need. Other things help us emancipate ourselves from the system. Yeah, I've just been talking about that. So, how am I doing for time? Great. So let's talk about some psychologically informed approaches that fit with transformation. And you'll be familiar with these if you have trained with Animas. We have, well, first of all, there's the integrative stance. We've talked about the unifying theory, so let's take that as read. But for me, cognitive behavioral coaching, cognitive behavioral theory in general, is phenomenally good at creating transformative shift. Now, if you use it as a cognitive behavioral practitioner, it might not create transformation. It might create better functioning within a given system. But when you use it in a transformative way, you're actually using the very tools of cognitive behavioral work to very deliberately unpick the thought processes, the mental maps, the cause and effect of the mental map and the beliefs behind it that create what I've put there as automaticity, which is how do we as human beings behave automatically because of what's happening up here. Now, one way to change that is to do cognitive behavioral work with a result of a particular behavioral shift. That's the cognitive behavioral way. But the transformative way is like, let's focus on the cognitive part. Let's focus on what is the thought, what is the belief, and is that something you even want to hold? And how might that belief represent us almost like a fractal of a wider system way of believing? So cognitive behavioral work is phenomenally useful, but we use it slightly different in transformative work. Then transactional analysis. There's a lot about TA I love and a lot I don't love. I'm not a big fan of things like life scripts, which I find A, too prescriptive, and B, just don't resonate with my lived experience of being a coach or a human being. But I think how transactional analysis helps somebody unpick their relational styles, their approaches to communication, and their sense of self and the ego states that we can fall into, again, through a level of automaticity, I think can be phenomenally useful as an entry point into transformative work. You know, once we start to accept that, oh, whoa, hold on a second, I'm responsible for my approach here. I'm responsible for my response here. That opens up a new way of thinking about the self, which is in itself transformative. And then we can look at something like narrative coaching, which for me opens up what I would call the world of meta meanings. Narratives to me are a way of thinking about what is the grand narrative of our life? What is the grand narrative of this incident that I'm allowing to affect me? And it also offers coherence to a given experience. And sometimes through a transformative process, we need to create a lack of coherence. We need to create a moment of chaos in order for a new kind of coherence to emerge. So narrative coaching is great for going, what is the story you've been telling yourself? And how might that be wrong? Or how might that be shifted in some way? Or what's being misremembered? Or what's being left out? And I talked about this in a different lecture, I think, was Michael White, who was one of the founders of narrative therapy, has this beautiful phrase, which is absent but implicit. And I really like that. It's like, what is absent from this story, but it, at the same time is implicitly affecting it? Well, one thing is the blinking system you're in, the mental paradigm system you're in. That's absent but implicit often in coaching because we take it for granted. And often we as coaches are part of that system, you know, whatever that system might be. we're also married, or we're also employees, or we're also bosses, or we're also human beings living in the UK, or we're also whatever it might be. And so there can often be a shared narrative which we don't question. And so using narrative coaching allows us to A, let the narrative unfold, and then B, start to look at what's the meta meaning and how do we break down the coherence to let a new one emerge. And then psychodynamic offers amazing opportunities for transformative work, because we can start to think about what are those inner drives. We don't need to buy into the kind of the truth of the idea of the ego, the id, the superego, and all that kind of stuff. We don't have to buy into it. We can if we choose to, but we don't have to. But we can certainly phenomenologically experience the fact that we have different things happening inside us. What's making that happen is arguable. But I think all human beings can go like, there's a part of me that wants this, and there's a part of me that wants that. Now, is that ego and id? Who knows? But it's certainly worth exploring, because we can start to say, well, how might we play with those ideas of parts to open up new possibilities? And then we can look at things like projection and transference and all those classic psychodynamic concepts as ways into transformative work. You know, if somebody's transferring onto me, or transferring onto a system, or transferring onto their partner, or transferring onto the world, it's useful to go, what if that's transference? What if that's not a truth for this person? What if it's transference we're experiencing here? What if I'm experiencing transference from the client? Or what if the client's transferring onto or projecting onto something else? How might that transform their experience of themselves or their worldview? So those are just a couple. By the way, there are no doubt many more, but those are the sort of the significant ones that for me feel like great routes into transformative change. Now, I want to kind of finish off with two areas. One is my model for a transformative inquiry, and the second one is the ethics bit. So let's quickly go into this. And as I said at the start, this is not some well thought out model that's had years of, battle hardened testing. I just started thinking about, what do I do when I'm working transformative? What's my kind of intuitive process? And so the way I tend to look at it is, number one, there's an invitation. No, it's not a knowing invitation, but I sometimes think it is a unconscious invitation. What do I mean by an invitation? I mean, there's like the client will say something or do something that just hints that there's something more at play here than is at the surface level. Like, yeah, you want a new job, but you've just said something that makes it seem like that's not so important. There's something else here. I call that the invitation. I think there's, I say I call it, like I made this up a few days ago, but I had different ideas in my mind. One was the gift, and then another one was like the glimpse. It doesn't matter what you call it. I'm just thinking about this psychoanalyst called Lacan, and Lacan and one of his kind of this disciples, I guess. I can't think how to say his name, but it's Zizek or Zizek, the Czech. I think he's Czechoslovakian. He talks about looking awry. That when you notice something from an angle, it offers a new opportunity. So I think of that as the invitation. Something in the frame of reference kind of announces itself in some way, and you're like, that's interesting. So they come for a new job, and you think it's performance coaching, but they say something, you just go like, that's kind of interesting, how they think about themselves, or how they think about jobs, or how they think about the world, or how they, whatever it might be. Oops. And then you get to the next phase, and this is really, really important. The next phase is permission. It doesn't mean that every time you see something, you have to say, may I get your permission to ... But it does mean that as you transition from one kind of coaching to another, let's say you're doing performance coaching or developmental coaching at a contractual level, if it's going to move into transformative work, you don't just go there. You say, I've noticed something that kind of intrigues me, that might be affecting this particular thing in a bigger way. I wonder if we might explore that. And you can share what you noticed or whatever, but you need their permission. You can't go diving into the mental model of the world unless that's the contract. If they come to you for transformative coaching in some very deliberate sense, great, you've got your permission. Next up is expand and deepen. So what I look to do is I try to get a much better understanding of what do they mean by this thing. So if they describe themselves as a certain kind of person, I'm really curious. Let's understand what this certain kind of person is first. What is the way you construe yourself as a human being? Where did that construal come from? What's the evidence for that? Like, let me really understand the background to this thing that you're saying. So I'm expanding and I'm deepening. And again, going back to Socrates, that's one of his great strengths, was he would inquire, what is justice? And then somebody said, justice is bloody blah, blah. And you go, interesting, tell me more. And essentially he would draw out from that person their concept of justice. And then he would say, what would happen if? So he would interrogate it. He would analyze, critique, and explore a la Socrates. Read Plato. Honestly, if you read Plato, you're like, wow, Socrates is not the soft, puffed person that the coaching world loves to make him sound like. People love to talk about Socratic questioning, as though Socratic questioning is open questioning. It wasn't. Socratic questioning was a deliberate deconstruction of somebody's assumption, very deliberate, finding ways in which their belief wasn't correct, such that they would give up on their belief. And by the way, most Socratic dialogues ended in what you might call an impasse. They have to go like, we don't know. And Socrates was okay with that. Isn't that such a beautiful mentality? Isn't that coaching? So we have to get you comfortable with the idea that we're not trying to find a truth here. We're trying to find a loosening of the bond of connection to the initial concept. So we analyze, we critique, we question, we look for evidence, we wonder if, and we hypothesize, we do anything to loosen up the idea. Then we look for wider possibilities. Well, what if that's not entirely true? What might be more useful? What else could happen here that would serve you in a different way? And then from there we can adopt and experiment. How might you try that? How might you try out this new belief? Or it might not even be a belief at this point. How might you try out this new possibility? I mean, that's an interesting thing itself. We so often talk about this idea of beliefs as though our job is to create new beliefs. I don't think it is. I think it's the client's job in the world to create new beliefs. It's our job to create possibilities that they can try in the world. And next up is reflection. So the client's back and they're thinking about, how did it go? You're exploring the lived reality of the change that they're evoking. And then finally, you're into that integration phase. How do you create longer term shift? And then of course, you're moving back around the circle. So fundamentally, if you're in a long-term contract with a client and it's transformative work, you're likely to see something else pop up or a recurrence of something. And it's just like, okay, there's another invitation. And we start moving around the circle again. And of course, each of these phases will take as long as it needs to. It could be that the right-hand side there, invitation, permission, expand, etc., takes a long time. Or it could be what really takes a long time is that, bang, they got the new possibilities. Now let me try them in the world. And that might be part of the transformative process. So this isn't a 6-stage process that takes place over 4 months. It's like, no. This is client-centered still, entirely client-centered. I am fully responsive to the client's needs through this. All right, let me finish up on ethics, and then we haven't got long for questions. So let me just quickly do this. So I think it's really important to talk about ethics. The first thing is contextual fit. I think if you're a transformative coach, you need to be aware of where does transformative coaching fit and what are you being contracted to do. So if you're working in an organization and you're contracted to do a certain thing with the organization, you better blink and well do what the organization's asking you, unless you have an explicit recontracting process with them. In other words, it's not, unless they're saying, hey, it's a free-for-all, go do what you need to with our clients or with your coachees. If there's a contract, that's the contract. So you need to make sure it's contextually fitting. And a challenge with transformative work is it can take a lot longer because you're fundamentally shaking up systems of belief rather than simply making them more effective within a given way of working. So contextual fit, really important. That's why transformative coaching, in my opinion, remains such a beautiful thing for life coaches to do. And I'm not saying it doesn't work for organizational coaching, it absolutely does, but there needs to be a lot more contracting around that. Life coaching, such a great fit for transformative work. And then secondly, all stakeholders need to be involved and agree on what's happening, whether that's HR or management or whatever it might be. It's really important that whoever the stakeholders are aware of the transformative contract you're about to go through. Next up is, let me just go back, readiness. By that, I mean both your readiness and the client's readiness. Are you ready to be a transformative coach, or are you still at that phase where doing role model coaching is really what you need to be doing? And that's fine, by the way. When I started as a coach in 2002, role model coaching was basically what I did for a number of years. So sometimes you have to kind of put the work in, but I think it's important to say, am I ready? Am I ready to do transformative work? And then clarity and transparency of the process with the client. In other words, make sure you have the conversation about, what does transformative work look like? Or what is the work we're doing look like? And is transformative work appropriate for this? So I think having that conversation is really important. There can be a real tendency for transformative coaches to become transformative without being clear that that's what's happening. And then again, coming back to readiness, competence. What's your skill set as a coach? Where do you need to go and where do you need to not go? There's always the risk that, I think I talked about this last time, one of the big dangers of integrative work is that a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing. And so we have to be careful that we don't suddenly go, oh my God, I read this thing about projection. And all of a sudden we see projection everywhere. Or I learned about transference. Or I learned about trauma. I'm going to start doing this stuff. It's like, are you sure you're competent? And that brings me to the next point, which is, I'll come back to that one. Next one is supervision. If you're going to do transformative work, I think supervision is an important component of your work, because it is such a deep way of working ultimately. You're not just helping somebody put a CV together, you're making them really think about themselves. And as part of that, personal critical reflection, I think is critical as well. What do you believe about the world and yourself and people and coaching and psychotherapy and counseling and psychology and business and entrepreneurship and whatever systems you're in? In other words, if you're going into an organization, what do you believe about organizations that you need to surface in your own mind to be absolutely sure that you're not either colluding with the system or somehow deliberately, albeit unconsciously, undermining the system? And then the last one is ongoing development. I think it's really important as transformative coaches that we're taking an ongoing development approach to this and really thinking, where's my next stage of growth as a coach? It's a very, very deep form of work we do compared to some of the other kinds. Not better, not worse, but certainly deeper. So on that note, come to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. I'm going to close off the recording now.